All right, great to see a good number for Bible study this morning. There is a new sheet on the back table for lesson number 10. If you're interested in that, it'll also be there after class if you want to grab it then. But you're welcome to go back and grab that now. And there are extra copies of lesson number 9 for today, which means we are in Hosea chapter 9. So turn your Bible to Hosea chapter 9. We get to cover the 17 verses of Hosea chapter 9 today. All right, it seemed like it was really easy to just sort of break the content down into two questions today. Some chapters lend themselves to different beyond two, like maybe 3 or 4 points. There were just really sort of two main points of the chapter this morning. So that's what we'll do. We'll cover 2 questions, but we've got a lot to discuss under each question. All right, so here's question number 1, and then I'm going to read the first 9 verses of chapter 9, and then we'll go back and open it up for discussion. But here's question number 1. God speaks to the vanity of their efforts, verses 1 through 9 of chapter 9 of Hosea. Looking back at the history of their apostasy, what should they have concluded? Why couldn't they see that? Why don't we see the same? And then do you think there's a tendency to think the end justifies the means? And why isn't this a scriptural way of thinking? So let's look at verses 1 through 9 and break the chapter up. First of all, in these first 9 verses. Do not rejoice, O Israel, with joy like other peoples, for you have played the harlot against your God. You have made love for hire on every threshing floor. The threshing floor and the winepress shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail in her. They shall not dwell in the Lord's land, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and shall eat unclean things in Assyria. They shall not offer wine offerings to the Lord, nor shall they sacrifice, or their sacrifices be pleasing to him. It shall be like bread of mourners to them. All who eat it shall be defiled. For their bread shall be for their own life. It shall not come into the house of the Lord. What will you do in the appointed day, and in the day of the feast of the Lord? For indeed they are gone because of destruction. Egypt shall gather them up. Memphis shall bury them. Nettles shall possess their valuables of silver. Thorns shall be in their tents. The days of punishment have come. The days of recompense have come. Israel knows. The prophet is a fool. The spiritual man is insane. Because of the greatness of your iniquity and great enmity, the watchman of Ephraim is with my God, but the prophet is a fowler's snare in all his ways, enmity in the house of his God. They are deeply corrupted, as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their iniquity. He will punish their sins. So there's a lot wrapped up in that. And we are going to discuss all 9 of those verses and then get really practical at the end. But before we do, what do you think about that? What's he telling them about their apostasy? What should they have remembered in the throes of the consequences of where they were? What should they have been thinking about at this point? They should have remembered how far they've come. And he'll even remind them of that. When you get to verse 10, he'll say, don't you remember where I brought you out of? Don't you remember that? And what you were back then and how far you've come? They should have remembered how far they had come. Any other thoughts on that before we dig in? Okay, let's take a look at verse 1. In verse 1, there's an implication, at least, that Israel was celebrating their harvests. You'll notice in verse 1, he says, do not rejoice. And the idea would be that you're rejoicing, but you don't need to be rejoicing. But they were celebrating their harvest as if the harvest was a sign of God's approval. And I didn't put this in my notes, but I think it's really important. Just because you have something physically in this life doesn't mean that's an endorsement from God. There are a lot of wicked people who prosper in this life, But it shouldn't be perceived as endorsement of God, like somehow He gave that personally as a way of saying you are spiritually okay. And they were doing that. They took the harvest as a sign that God was endorsing their activity, and that was just simply not true. Did you have your hand up, Tommy? Yep.
Well, we even see that today.
Yeah.
Especially among denominational.
Sure.
Because they're doing real well in life.
Yep.
Which I guess we, as Christians, we should give God thanks.
Oh, no doubt.
Knowing that they're not in the family of God.
Right.
That they really think that God's blessing them.
Yeah, you can't take money or expansion or whatever. You can't take that as a sign that God is approving of what you're doing. The only way to know that we have God's approval is through His Word, what He tells us to do. But we have to be really careful. And Israel was doing that. They're doing that very same thing. And God says, don't rejoice. There's no reason for you to be rejoicing right now. Bobby, go ahead.
I know it's not scriptural, but it makes me think of the song that's selected first for Eddie's funeral, Farther Along.
Yeah.
To understand why. Why do people reap great benefits when they are sinful?
Yeah. So and that's been a struggle. God's people, when they look out and they see the sinful people of the world prospering, that always reminds me of Psalm 73. That psalm was written, a fellow by the name of Asaph, one of the singers of Israel, wrote that song. And he looks out and he sees the wicked prospering, and he really struggles through about the first 15 or 16 verses. And he's like, eventually he'll say, and then I understood their end. I understood what's going to happen to them. But that's always a great struggle where people in the world really prosper, and they were prospering, and they were idolaters. And God says, don't rejoice. You have no reason to be rejoicing. So He tells them not to do that. They were actually attributing their success to their idols and seeing, oddly enough, the success as a stamp of God's approval. So they were very convoluted in the way they were thinking about that. He even says in verse 1 that they have made love for hire. That's a reference to their idolatrous practices, and they had played the harlot. So God is reminding them, you have no reason to rejoice right now. This is calamities coming upon you. This is not a joyous time. Then in verse 2, all that success that they thought that they had was about to be taken away. So another reason for them to not rejoice was that it was all about to be taken away. The remaining patience of God was about to be gone when He says, the threshing floor and the winepress shall not feed them, the new wine shall fail in her. So all those things that they were placing their trust in was about to be taken away. All those crops were temporary, so to speak. Then in verse 3, He reminds them that they're not going to dwell in the Lord's land. Now, there's a lot of, I say debate when it says they shall not dwell in the Lord's land, because there is a sense, true or false, that every land is the Lord's land. Is that true? I mean, it all belongs to Him. You've got Psalm 24, 1 and 2, that all the hills are His to 1,000 miles. You've got that. The idea would be that He owns everything. So there's a sense. But when He says the Lord's land, what do you think He's talking about in the Lord's land, Joel? Yes, okay. So when He speaks of the Lord's land, He's talking about you're not going to stay in Palestine. You're not staying here. You're going to vacate this through captivity. So Palestine is what He's talking about, the promised land that God gave to their forefathers. Now, what does He mean in verse 3 when He says, Ephraim shall return to Egypt? So Ephraim is, that's the northern kingdom. Why would they return to Egypt? I thought they're going to Assyria. What's the Egyptian thing here? Captivity? Yeah. It's a metaphor. Where had they been in their past? They had been in Egypt. They had come out of that. So Egypt was synonymous with captivity. And you'll see another reference to it down in verse 6. He says, Egypt shall gather them up. Well, not literally. They didn't literally go to Egypt. But the cities of Egypt like Memphis shall bury them. So He's telling them they're going into captivity. But He says it in verse 3, they shall eat unclean things in Assyria. So it's like Egyptian captivity. It's just in Assyria. And when I read this in verse 3, I don't know if you thought about this too, when it says, they shall eat unclean things in Assyria. Obviously, when you are captive, you are forced into the culture and whatever the lifestyle, even dietary choices of your captors are. you remember the story in Daniel chapter 1? I know it's Babylonian captivity. Remember Daniel? And then you have, we call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, the four Hebrew youths that went into Babylonian captivity. What was their test in the very first chapter of Daniel? Remember what it was? To eat the king's meat. And they said, we're not going to do that. That's not right for us to do that. Remember that big competition? And God allowed them to fare better on the diet that they were on, but they were being forced into a similar situation where they would have had to have eaten unclean things in captivity. That's just going to be one of the consequences of what they face of captivity. Then in verse 4, God says He will reject them and their offerings when He says they'll not offer wine offerings to the Lord, nor shall their sacrifices be pleasing to Him. So no matter what they do at this point, God is going to reject their sacrifices. And this is interesting. This is why it's good for us to have sort of a well-rounded understanding of the Bible, because sometimes references in the prophets go back a bit. And there is one here. He talks about, in verse 4, it shall be like the bread of mourners, and all who eat it will be defiled. What is the historical reference here? What's he talking about? Under the Levitical law, if a person died in a house, what happened to everything that was in the house where the dead body was at? It became unclean. And if there was bread in the house, even if the bread wasn't physically corrupted, if you ate the bread, what happened to you? You became unclean. You became defiled. That's what he's talking about here. Bread of mourners, bread that had been in the house where a dead body was, and so the bread would become defiled. And he's making the point in verse 4, for their bread shall be for their own life. They might eat it to sustain their physical life, but he says, it shall not come into the house of the Lord. Nothing they do is going to be acceptable to God. Spiritually, there's nothing they can do at this point to reverse course in the sense of stopping captivity and getting rid of all that, because things were set in motion that were not going to be undone. But he makes reference to the irreversibility of their plight, I guess you could say. Nothing was going to change at that point. They were like a house full of dead bodies, and everything that they were touching was defiled as well. In verse 5, he talks about how they would be deprived of worship and access to worship in verse 5 when he says, what will you do in the appointed day? What are you going to do? He says, and in the day of the feast of the Lord. Let's say that you do want to come back. Let's say that you do want to offer a feast. When you're in Assyria, you can't do that. You're going to be withheld from those things. You're going to be cut off from the feasts. There's going to be no connection to God, because it would be complete and utter removal from those things. I thought about this too. That, there's a lot of secondary effect on what was happening to the people at this point have been largely destroyed. But for example, even today when those, like the feasts take place in the Jewish nation, it's not just for them a religious thing, it's a very social thing. Families did this together. And when they were removed from that, it would destroy their social life. Everything that they had cherished and valued over these years was gone. So, for example, during the feasts, even though they weren't honoring them, like, say, the Feast of the Passover, they still all came together. And you might have reunions of family members that you never got to see. That's gone in captivity. He's taking all that away. So all of it is going to be gone. They just hadn't thought through the consequences of these things. In verse 6, he talks about, again, Egypt and one of the cities of Egypt, Memphis, but these are figures of slavery. He does mention in verse 6 that there will be nettles and thorns. What are nettles? What is it? Yeah, it's like a briar bush. It's like a prickly plant. But in the Bible, it's often used as a figure for desolation, and that's the way it's being used here. Thorns would represent the barrenness and the hardship of it all, but he's talking about how hard their captivity is going to be. Then in verse 7, he says the days of punishment have come, so obviously it's upon them. But there's some language here, and I'll appreciate your input on this. I think I know how he's framing this, but not all commentators are settled on this. He says the days of recompense have come. Obviously, Israel knows. Obviously, they're very aware of what's happening at this point. And then he says, the prophet is a fool. The spiritual man is insane. So there's two different categories of people there and two different descriptions of these people. First of all, he says the prophet is a fool. How do you take that? I'm curious. Do you take this as a reference to the false prophets or what they thought of the prophets of God that were actually telling the truth? How do you take that, Joel? What do you think of that? What's that?
I said, take your pick.
Yeah, I know.
You're right, you don't.
Commentators are...
Hosea, you're a fool, or the false prophet.
Yeah. The commentators are pretty divided on that. Yeah, I don't think it would affect the interpretation either way because it's a vice versa thing. They thought Hosea was a fool. They thought Jeremiah was a fool. If he's talking about the prophets or the false prophets, they were really fools. They really were foolish men because they were prophesying falsely. It could be that you have a little of both here. You could have sort of one of those vice versa. When he's talking about the prophet as a fool, he may actually be talking about the false prophet. They are foolish men. But when he says the spiritual man is insane, that could be what they well thought of people like Hosea. They were accused of being insane, and sometimes they were, like they had just lost their mind. They were out of kilter. But I'm not sure, because either way it would be true, whether they thought that of this God speaking of false prophets, or in some ways talking about what they thought of the righteous men of God. Art, I saw your hand.
People thought Noah was foolish.
Oh yeah, they must have thought Noah was insane. Yes. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think the interpretation is harmed either way. I think either way. I will say this. Hold your place and go with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. I think this is probably a good marginal note in the Bible. Verse 18 beginning, 1 Corinthians 1. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. The Jews require a sign, the Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, to the Greeks foolishness. And then he ends that section, verse 25, the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. What people in this world deem foolish and what God calls foolishness are often in conflict with each other. And there's a great irony between those things. So however you take that in Hosea, and I'm torn. I don't know definitively because I can see it both ways. I can see this as God mocking the prophets and mocking their so-called spiritual people. But this also could be what they thought of the actual real prophets of God. So either way, I don't think it does any disservice to the text. Yeah, Ellis?
So I'm not saying that this is necessarily definitive,
Yeah.
but following with verse 8, where it says, the prophet is the watchman of Ephraim with my God, yet a foul snare is on all his ways, and hatred in the house of his God.
Yeah.
That kind of leads me to think that they're talking
Yeah,
about
yeah,
the
yeah.
actual prophet of God as opposed to the false prophets or whatever.
Yeah, and the idea perhaps is that they just consider them insane. Like, how can you not go along with what the will of the people is? Why would you prophesy against the will of the people and cause such contradiction? In verse 8, he does say, the watchman of Ephraim is with my God. And that's kind of the way that's phrased and the way it's translated is difficult. There is a set of commentators who are very good on Hebrew, and they say this is probably better translated, a spy is Ephraim with my God. And the idea seems to be that Israel, they did not depend on Hosea to tell the truth. They just didn't think that Hosea was telling the truth. And so what they were doing was they were counting on their own prophets to tell the truth, and those prophets became to them a trap and a snare, which is what Ellis was just talking about. Their false prophets became a snare to them. By refusing God and by following idols, they became the enemies of God. And then verse 9, obviously they were deeply corrupted. Nothing was sacred to them. And he mentions here a historical thing. He doesn't explain it. There's no explanation other than just the mere passing reference to it. He mentions, as in the days of Gibeah. And he's saying, you are so gone that you're acting just like what happened in the days of Gibeah. Do you know that story? What happened, Terry?
Well, yes, there was a young old lady. I talked about that time.
Mhm.
All night, and then the next morning she died.
So the story actually starts with, and they did this, so if you didn't hear Terry, there's a young girl that gets raped. Originally, when there was a Levite, he had this concubine. The Levite is passing through, and the men of the city told the owner of the house we're staying, you bring to us the Levite so we can rape him. They wanted to rape the man, and he wouldn't do it. And he puts the Levite's concubine out there, and they rape her all night long, and they leave her at the doorstep. And it's just the most horrific thing that happens. And now he's saying in verse 9, they are so corrupted, they've become like the men of Gibeah who did that horrible thing. That's how far gone that the Israelites had. They had no shame in their behavior that they had done things like this.
Well, it was said at that time that was the worst sin that ever been committed at that point.
Yeah, it was terrible. It was terrible. And what's interesting is when you read that story in Judges 19, and I think it continues through chapter 20, I think. Yeah, 20, 22. It just ends. That's the end of the story. And you don't really get the end of it. Does it appear here, like sort of secondary commentary in verse 9, those men didn't, spiritually, they never got away with it. God was very well aware of what they did. Is God taking care of the men who did that thing in Gibeah? Yes. Just like he's going to take care of the people who did similar things in Israel. So they had fallen so far that they had become like what happened in Gibeah. So now that leads us to the practical side of this, about what they should have been thinking about and how they were trying to rationalize their behavior. I know he mentions here in verse 7, he mentions insanity. What is the we sort of, in culture, we have this practical definition of insanity. What is insanity in a practical definition of it? Have you heard it before? It's when you do the same thing over and over and over again and get the same results. You don't get any different results, and you're failing every time, and you just keep getting the same results, but you do the same thing over again. That's insanity. And these people, for generation after generation after generation, were reaping the consequences of bad behavior, and every new generation that would come up, they would do exactly the same thing. And at some point you would think, why don't we change our behavior to see if we can get a different result? And they were not doing that. They should have concluded, this is not working for us. It's not working for us. And then they should have made the effort to try and fix that. But the question then is begged, why didn't they do that? Why couldn't they do that? And it's as much a lesson for us as it should have been for them. Why couldn't they see their problem and fix their problem? Why couldn't they? What do you think, Bobby?
I think in Matthew 7, 3 and 4, where you have the mote in your own eye, but
Yeah.
you see the speck in your brother's.
That's true. Some of it may have been that. Maybe they focused on others and couldn't even see their own faults. Maybe they thought pagan nations were worse than they were, and that they weren't as bad. Gene?
Well, just taking a look at our Congress today with all the corruption
A lot of it.
and graft and everything, and this has been going on for I don't know how many years.
Yeah.
And, you know, they're mad because they got caught, but they're not mad that they wasted trillions
Right.
of dollars.
Yeah.
So humanity has changed a bit.
Yeah. It's lack of repentance and lack of remorse over that. Insensitivity and apathy, I think, plays a lot of that. Do you think it's possible, even for us, do you think it's possible to develop a worldview around a sin so that it sort of sits at the center of a worldview? And if it does that, it's almost impossible to see yourself as wrong. If, for example, if God is a little sliver of your worldview, but your worldview's around a sin, you don't see that worldview as wrong because God is somewhere in one of the slices of the pie going around. God is there, and you don't see it. And I think for generations, they had developed their entire way of life had centered around idolatry. And God may have been a little sliver of their worldview. I mean, he really wasn't part of it. They acknowledged that he was there, but not much. And it was really hard for them to see how far they had come, especially when you have securities that come from that lifestyle. And so for whatever reason, they just didn't see it. And if we're not careful, we can fall into the same trap too. We are warned in 2 Peter chapter 2 that we can actually have escaped the pollution of the world and then go back in it. And that's kind of a scary thing, Terry.
Why did they even Solomon, with all his wisdom, God directly told him, you follow my commands and
Yeah.
do what I'm expecting of you, you'll be blessed all the days of your life. Well, he in his final days, he was led astray.
Yeah, I just think that we have to be careful because I think the tendency is to look back and say, look at the terrible things they were doing. We don't do terrible things like that. And while it may not come out in the same consequences, idolatry is idolatry, and it's really terrible. And if we're caught in it, spiritually it's the same thing, and sometimes we just fail to see that we're doing the same thing. So I mentioned a phrase here. Do you think that sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking the end justifies the means? We do that, right? And the idea is as long as we get the result we're looking for, it doesn't matter how you get to the end result. This is sort of a pragmatic approach to life where you sort of have this end justifies the means. Any action that produces the desired end is okay. So, for example, for them, as long as they got their crops, as long as they went to a feast day and honored God on a certain feast day, then no matter what else they did throughout the rest of the year was okay. The means didn't matter as much as the ends matter. Is that a good way of thinking? Why is that not a good way of thinking? Isn't that what Jesus was exposing in the Sermon on the Mount? When he said, you've heard that it was said by those of old time, you should not kill. But I'm telling you, don't even hate somebody in your heart. What is he saying? Is he saying that the end matters? Does the end matter? Do the means matter? Both matter to God. And so the means to get to the end, both of those things matter. And we cannot be pragmatic in our approach like they were being, where they were saying, it doesn't matter how you get there as long as you get there. And God's saying it matters how you get there, and it matters where you end up at, because both of those things matter together. And we can fall into the same trap. We can do the same thing. An example of that would be like, for example, in a congregation, should we have a goal of reaching people in the community? Does it matter how we reach people in the community? Yeah, the means matter how we reach people. And so we don't want to fall in the trap that they were in. And they should have, at this point, they should have realized how far gone they were, but they weren't seeing it for all the reasons that you talked about. Okay, let's get to question number 2, so we've got time to finish that. Question number 2. God points them back to their beginning and reminds them of better times in verses 10 through 17. Why did Israel struggle so often to be faithful to God? And I mean that in a historical way. Why historically did they struggle? Do you see any parallels to the church today? What about as a nation? As a nation, should we be reflecting back on history? What should we learn from history politically and or spiritually and religiously? So let's look at verse 10 beginning. I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first fruits on the fig tree in its first season. But they went to Baal Peor and separated themselves to that shame. They became an abomination like the thing they loved. As for Ephraim, their glory shall fly away like a bird. No birth, no pregnancy, and no conception. Though they bring up their children, yet I will bereave them to the last man. Yes, woe to them when I depart from them. Just as I saw Ephraim like Tyre planted in a pleasant place, so Ephraim will bring out his children to the murderer. And I've mentioned this before. Every now and then, if it's translated good, you'll see these very long dashes that sometimes follow statements in the Bible. It represents a pause in thought. And, you see it, Moses does that. When he comes off the mountain, when Moses is coming off the mountain and he sees the golden calves and the people worshiping the golden calves, and he's so distraught by it that he starts to talk to the Lord, and the Lord even responds, and there's this long pause. Well, Hosea does that here, and I don't want you to lose the effect of that. This is Hosea talking, and he says, "Give them, O Lord." He can't even hardly finish the statement. What will you give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. See, he's distraught at what's taken place. All their wickedness is in Gilgal. For there I hated them because of the evil of their deeds. I will drive them out from my house. I will love them no more. All their princes are rebellious. Ephraim is stricken. Their root is dried up. They shall bear no fruit. Yes, were they to bear children, I would kill the darlings of the womb. My God will cast them away because they did not obey him, and they shall be wanderers among the nations. And I just think those pauses in Scripture are just so profound. Because obviously there's great emotion built in this. He's being inspired to do it, but Hosea feels that emotion, but so does God. He's so upset at the people. Okay, so the question is here, what does he remind them of, and why couldn't they stay like that? What's his historical reference here? What does he mean when he says, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness? I saw the fathers like the first fruits on the fig tree in its first season. What's he saying? Historically, where's he going back to? Egypt, right? He's going all the way back to when he brought them out and started them as a nation. And what were they like when God first saw them in Egypt? Now, I know they were in captivity, but when they were brought out, what was his affection and his feeling toward them? They were his children. Was he excited about them? Yeah. And look at these figures, like grapes in the wilderness. Now, that may not mean a whole lot to us, but why would that be such a wonderful figure to describe the children of Israel in that context, in that area? Yeah, okay, yeah, no, there's no contamination. Just imagine that you're in this almost desolate area, and there's this row of grapes and how juicy and refreshing they are. And God is saying that of the people, that they were like that. They were once faithful to God, and their faithfulness was so exciting, and it brought joy, just like a bunch of grapes would do. And like fresh figs, they were just so refreshing. The people would understand those figures over there. But, he said, they went to Baal Peor. Now, there's another historical reference there. This is when you have the story of Balaam. Remember Balaam? So you've got Balak that comes to Balaam, and Balak says, look, Israel's pretty mighty, and I need you to do something. I need you to curse those people so that God won't be on their side anymore. Like somehow he had the power to do that. And at first he rejects. Remember, he said, God told me I can't do it. And then he goes back to God a second time after he's offered riches. And God's using a little sarcasm. And God actually says, do what you want to do. Just do what I told you to do. Which the first time was don't go. And so he gets up and he gets on his donkey and he starts on the way. And remember, the donkey is stopped by the angel of God, the messenger of God. And the donkey actually is empowered to turn and talk to Balaam once he starts getting beat by Balaam. You have this several chapters, and Balaam goes up to the top of these mounts, and he gets all the way up to the point of cursing people. He never does it. Never does it. And the story ends with Balak just kind of going away, very upset that Balaam never fulfilled his end. And the very next thing you read in chapter 25 of Numbers, and it says, and the people sinned at Baal Peor. And they committed fornication, and they gave themselves over to idols. And then you get to the New Testament, and it talks about how Balaam loved the wages of sin, And then it talks about in Revelation through the counsel of Balaam, and we put all the pieces of the puzzle together, and it means on the way out when Balaam was leaving, while he never cursed the people of God on the mounts, on the way out he goes, you do know they have a tendency toward idolatry. And it's all it took. And he mentions it right here when he says they went to Baal Peor. That was the beginning of many troubles for the people of God. Now, that was the first instance. Jeroboam really kind of brought it back in, but they didn't really resist it when Jeroboam brought it back in. But that's the reference to Baal Peor. And it says they separated, they consecrated themselves to that shame. They gave themselves over to it. I mean, it became their life. And then he says they became an abomination like the thing they loved. They just became the very lifestyle that they were trying to go after. And of course, there's always a principle there. We end up imitating the things that we love. And they imitated the lifestyle of idolaters. They became idolaters as a result of that. In verse 11, God sustained Israel for generations, but he was not going to sustain them anymore. Their glory was going to fly away like a bird. It wouldn't be the same anymore. And he mentions in verse 11, no birth, no pregnancy, and no conception. Now, that doesn't mean that they would never have children anymore again. But what had they been placing their confidence in? The size of Israel and the numbers. And they were not going to have the numbers like they did anymore. As a nation, they once counted on those numbers, and they would be reduced and torn apart and fractured. And that had been predicted in Deuteronomy 28. God predicted that he would do that. In verse 12, he mentions the same thing. Their numbers would be brought low. Even if they bring up children, he's going to bereave them to the last man. So he's just talking about through death and war and many other things that their numbers would never be quite the same again. And in verse 13, they were so blessed, like Tyre had once been, very blessed. And just like Tyre, they became self-sufficient and proud and boastful. You can read about that in Ezekiel 27, about the once blessed state of Tyre, but how they became inappropriate and immoral, self-sufficient. And she set herself up for justice. That's what Israel had done. And Isaiah even talks about that in Isaiah 28, how they did this to themselves. In verse 14, you see Hosea's struggle here. He's lamenting the fact. God is lamenting the fact of what's happening to them. But he is agreeing with God in verses 11 to 13. He's agreeing with them here in verse 14 that God is just in what he's doing. In verse 15, he talks about the wickedness in Gilgal. Some believe that is a place near Shechem. And talking about some of the idolatrous practices that had been taking place. Not only is it the place where they sinned, but just like others, it sort of the place became synonymous with their unbelief. And he does talk about in Hosea 4, we already referenced that in verse 15 of chapter 4. It was one of the seats of their idolatry. Shechem had become that, and Gilgal's probably connected to that. Sadly, they stopped loving God and they resisted his love for them in verse 15. And in verse 16, he mentions how they are like a dried up root. No nourishment, unable to produce. They're just good for nothing at this point. Any fruit would be just as worthless as the tree right at this point. So they are very corrupted. And in verse 17, they are cast away because they did not obey. And it's interesting, he mentions here, I'll get your thoughts on this, they shall be wanderers among the nations. Obviously, they were scattered in Assyria. Did they ever come back and populate Palestine the way that they once did? They never did. Never came back to it. Now, there's a huge Jewish concentration even today in Palestine, but not like it was, not like in these days. When Assyrian captivity took place and then eventually Babylonian captivity did away with the rest of it, they were scattered. And so now you have like heavy Jewish populations, like you've got big populations in Russia and Asia, and lots of places have big, heavy Jewish populations. New York State has the highest Jewish population of any place. It has more Jews in New York State than they do even in Palestine today. They're scattered, and God told them that's what was going to happen, and it came true in verse 17. Now, let's get to the practical real quick. Just a note before, because we're out of time. Their apostasy falls to a few problems They wanted to be like the nations around them, but ultimately it was their disbelief in God's ability to provide for them. Numbers 14 was the breaking point, right? They sent the spies out, they came back, the people followed the unbelieving spies, and that was it. And history is therefore recorded for them to learn from. They should have been learning from that, and they did not learn. Just real quick, religiously, we should learn from history. We should know what happens when there are, for example, deviations from organization, or the desire to be like false religions, or binding where God has not bound, or loosing where God has not loosed. There's serious historical consequences that come from that. Nationally speaking, is there still value as a nation in learning from history? Should we? Yes. For example, should we learn the lesson that communism is a really terrible thing? You think we would learn that? Or that free enterprise is good. Historically, it's been good. Or a nation must be wise in its, Gene mentioned it, in its spending. You can't spend money you don't have without there being serious consequences for that. History has proven what kind of consequences come from that. So history is a good teacher, and that's why God told them, you should have learned from history, but now you're in a bad position. Okay, guys, thank you so much. There's a lot wrapped up in that chapter. Chapter 10 is about wasted opportunities. We've broken that down in 2 questions. Grab a copy of the notes. We'll look forward to discussing that next week. Thank you so much, guys. Appreciate it.